So what do? I don't think we have to have huge, big solutions. There's some things that we can do. One thing is we can always train ourselves to ask the other question. I see the sexism in this, but do I see the racism in it? I see the homophobia in this, but do I see the classism in it? Just telling ourselves that we need to ask additional questions sometimes opens up possibilities that we had never seen. What we have to be prepared to do is to take the history that we know about and repudiate that history and move to a different awareness, a different politics, a different consciousness about women. We can celebrate some of our victories, but it's important for us to learn. It's important for us to move away from images of women's rights that look exclusive and exclusionary and to different ideas about how inclusion is supposed to look. Right? Now, at the end of the day, I want to suggest that we fantasize. And as long as we're fantasizing about boys not learning the message of absorbing violence, why not wish for a world where children don't learn that racial exclusion is normative and okay, where Americans don't learn that their security is primary above all, where atrocities against civilians all over the world done in the name of our way of life is acceptable. As long as we are imagining and fantasizing about a female president, why not fantasize about a truly intersectional feminist politics? As long as we're imagining a world without war, why don't we imagine a world without prisons? As long as we are attacking the military-industrial complex, its drain on our resources, its play on our fears, its endless demand for human lives, why don't we attack the prison industrial complex, which depletes our resources, feeds on our fears, and devours lives in the very same way? It's only by taking intersectionality seriously as a prism, as an ethic, as a way of reading, as a way of interpreting, as a way of imagining, can we make those hopes about how women coming to power will equate peace. Only through incorporating intersectionality can we really realize the hope that seems to emanate from all of us. Thank you very much. So what is intersectional feminism and why is it important? Well, we've been talking about women and power against the backdrop of women's political participation. And there's so much excitement now that we have to really think about what do we know about women and political participation historically. What are some of the lessons that we might learn from it? Well, let's think a minute about the struggle for women's political power right here in the United States. In about 15, 20 years, we're going to celebrate the centennial of women's right to vote. And knowing as I do how we in America like to celebrate things like anything that happened here was the greatest thing that ever happened in the world, I can imagine how excited everybody's going to be. But here's the question. When do I, as an African-American woman, get to celebrate my entry into the political community? In reality, I've got to wait another 40 years to celebrate because the situation was that giving blacks to vote did not empower blacks who were women. And giving women the right to vote did not empower women who were black. So this, quite simply, is what I call structural intersectionality, the collision of two overlapping dynamics of oppression. Patriarchy reared its head during the debate over the 15th Amendment. It was the Negro's hour, they said, right? So the Negro's hour apparently meant that it was not Negro women's hour, it was Negro men's hour. Well, what happened when the women's hour came to vote some 30 years later? By that time, blacks had been so thoroughly disenfranchised that black women won nothing when women won the right to vote. Now, you're not going to read this story in our history books, and it certainly isn't part of our political culture. We celebrate women's enfranchisement and the women who led the struggle as though it's an unabashed victory for women. The fact that a whole lot of women were left at the station falls from our consciousness, as does the racial strategy that the suffragettes followed to win the vote for women. In fact, one of the main arguments for women's suffrage was that it would help shore up white supremacy. Women, it was argued, would be the helpmates to maintain the American way of life against lower order citizens and all these immigrants. Adding millions of white women voters to the rolls would ensure that democracy would survive. It was not an accidental argument, nor an isolated one. Now, I don't want this to be a one-sided critique, because African American men weren't any better on the question of whether black women should get the right to vote. His basic sense was that they were better off left disenfranchised. With friends like these, need I say more? So what's the moral of this story? Why is this important? I mean, you might say, come on, this is ancient history. What does it have to do with contemporary politics? Well, let's ask a couple questions. What might have happened had enfranchisement truly been universal? If women's power wasn't seen and celebrated as white women's power, if enfranchising the slaves had not been seen as enfranchising the men, if feminism had been seen early on as incorporating all women, black and immigrant, Native and Asian, if anti-racism had been seen as incorporating all people of color, men as well as women, what might have happened and where would our culture be now if the fight against patriarchy and the fight against white supremacy had not become alien to each other? And if the women who were subject to both had been centered rather than marginalized in these struggles? We can barely imagine how political life might be different in the here and now. What happens when women who are suffering from violence in a context where the feminist movements come looking and they can't see them? What happens when feminist surveillance can't see their flares because they're buried under the debris of race, of class, of nation, of all other kinds of isms? Let's talk about what the standard lens misses. Let's talk about, say, women who are incarcerated. What leads women to prison? Not violent crime, usually crimes of either drug addiction, which is a direct result for many women of abuse, or abuse itself, which leads many women into criminal enterprises with men who are engaged in drug trafficking. So everything about the risk leading women to prison is thoroughly gendered. What happens when they get into prison? Is that gendered? Absolutely. Women who are incarcerated are more likely to lose all family contact than men. What about their children? Women stand the risk of losing their children if they are in foster care more than 20 months. Well, the average sentence is 60 months. So what are we saying about those children? What we're looking at is a crisis of women and children and communities. Consequences after release. Our Congress, in its glorious wisdom, decided that there was one crime for which you could never receive public benefits again. Is it murder? Is it rape? Is it treason? It's being convicted of a drug crime. It's the one crime. So those women who are the most vulnerable, the women who are least likely to even get a job before they went to prison won't get one afterwards. The ones who most are in need of support to hold on to their families, most in need of public housing in order to find a place for their children to live, are the ones most punished by a punitive drug policy. Okay, so everything about this is gendered. So, does it turn up on our agenda? Is it a feminist issue? Do we talk about this as an imperative of feminist organizing? No. And why is it? It doesn't fit the prototype. We don't think about a woman in prison as a subject of feminism. We don't think about their issues because they're different from the prototype. They're Black and Latina, they're poor, many of them are drug addicted, many of them live in urban areas. They don't cross our consciousness, they don't cross our understanding. How is that? How is it can happen? Let me give you an example from the Immigrant Women and Marriage Fraud Act. Some time ago, our Congress, again in their infinite wisdom, decided that they wanted to crack down on immigration. So what did they do? They said any woman who comes to this country to marry someone has to wait 2 years before she gets her green card. It's called the Marriage Fraud Act, right? So when some of these women came to get married, not too surprisingly, the men they married were not the best men. They became abusive men. They abused women. So what was the choice of an immigrant woman who comes to marry an abuser? Does she go to the authorities? Does she seek help? Does she call the police, knowing that her right to stay here is probably jeopardized beyond repair? If she turns to the authorities, she won't stay properly married, she can't get her green card. Most of these women chose not to. What happened to them? They were abused, battered, some were even killed. Now, why is this that no one saw this as a problem? These women fell under the wheels of xenophobia and misogyny, and where they landed was a place that neither the anti-violence movement nor the immigration movements dared to tread. Now, if women and feminism is really an idea about a politic of liberation, this really matters to us. We can't afford this any longer. If feminism is a prism for transformation, rather than an excuse for elevating some women over others, then we have got to care about this if we want to have more effective remedies. If we aren't intersectional, some of us, the most vulnerable, are going to fall through the cracks.